Who can picture this? A little island, rainy, grey, not exactly screaming world conqueror, is it? Yet somehow, the tiny speck of land managed to control a quarter of the entire planet. We're talking 1 in 3 people alive, answered the British monarch. Mental, isn't it? So how did Britain, yes, rainy, the obsessed Britain become the largest empire the world has ever seen? Buckle up, because this story is absolutely wild. Mind content. Now, if you glance at Britain on a map today, you'd think it's just those islands up in the North Atlantic, right? But zoom out, have a proper look around the globe. You'll spot these little dots, 14 territory, actually where the Union Jack still flies. Gibraltar guarding the Mediterranean. The Falklands way down in the South Atlantic. These tiny remnants are all that's left of something truly massive. 100 years ago, Britain ruled over lands so vast that the sun literally never set on them. Imagine that for a second. Somewhere in the world, at every single moment, it was daytime in British territory. But here's the mad bit. This all started before Britain was even Britain. Let's rewind to medieval times. England was the dominant force on these islands, wealthy, militarily strong, proper sorted. They'd already muscled their way into Wales and the chunks of Ireland. But Scotland wasn't having any of it. Those Scots fought off English invasions time and time again. Fierce doesn't even begin to cover it. Fast forward to the early 1600s. Queen Elizabeth I is on the throne, and she's handing out these special licenses to adventurers. Blokes like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher are sailing off to claim lands for England. Sounds exciting, yeah? Well, here's the thing, nobody actually stuck around to settle these places. The first proper attempt at an English colony in North America, at Roanoke Island in 1585, went horribly wrong. The colonists just vanished, completely disappeared, never heard from again. Creepy stuff. But Elizabeth had another trick up her sleeve. She created these trading companies, the Levant Company and the famous East India Company, and gave them total monopolies on trade with certain regions. These weren't just businesses, they were engines of empire, and they were just getting started. When Elizabeth died in 1603, James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne. Suddenly, Scotland and England shared a king. They weren't united yet, still separate kingdoms, but this union of the crown set something in motion. Now, here's where it gets interesting. James wanted to crack this whole colonization thing properly. He set up 3 different types of colonies. Crown colonies, run directly by the monarch through an appointed governor. Charter colonies, which gave settlers with more freedom under corporate charters. And the proprietary colonies, managed by individuals who ran them like businesses. Each had its flavor, but they all served the same purpose, expanding English power abroad. And there's this fascinating bit that often gets overlooked. The plantation of Ulster in Northern Ireland became a blueprint for everything that followed. Protestant settlers from Scotland and England were shipped over to Ireland, and this organized approach to colonization. It worked, so they copied it everywhere else. Throughout the 1600s, England went on an absolute spree. Colonies popped up across North America and the Caribbean. Some were built from scratch, others were nicked from rivals. New York was snatched from the Dutch in 1665, cheeky really. Meanwhile, they're building trading posts in Africa and the East Indies. And then comes the Royal African Company in 1660, which became central to something truly horrific: the transatlantic slave trade. Brutal, lucrative, a stain on history that Britain would profit from for decades. Now, Scotland wanted in on this action. They'd watched England getting wealthy from colonies and they thought, why not US? But nearly every Scottish attempt crashed and burned. Nova Scotia failed. Cape Breton, disaster. But nothing nothing compared to the Darien scheme of 1698. Scotland raised an absolutely bonkers amount of money, roughly a fifth of the nation's entire wealth, to establish a colony in Panama. The plan was to control the overland trade route between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Brilliant idea, terrible execution. The settlers landed, built a place called New Edinburgh, and then everything went wrong. Disease, starvation, Spanish attacks. Of the 2,500 people who set out, only a few hundred limped back to Scotland. The financial disaster was so catastrophic it plunged the entire nation into crisis. Suddenly, uniting with England didn't seem so bad. At least they'd get a slice of that colonial pie. In 1707, the Acts of Union passed, and England and Scotland became Great Britain, one kingdom, one parliament, and crucially, one empire. Britain immediately got stuck into wars with other European powers. When the War of the Spanish Succession wrapped up in 1714, Britain walked away with Newfoundland, Acadia, Gibraltar, and Menorca, Narabad Howl. Meanwhile, the British East India Company was scrapping with the French across India. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, they wrestled control of Bengal away from local rulers and different forces. This made the company the dominant power in the region, and they used it as a launchpad to expand even further. Then came the 7 Years' War, and this is where things went properly global. Britain seized Quebec in 1759, effectively booting France out of North America. They grabbed Florida from Spain. Suddenly, they controlled nearly the entire eastern seaboard of North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 added even more Caribbean islands: Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, Tobago. Britain was now the undisputed maritime and colonial superpower. The secret to all this? Two things. First, the Royal Navy, absolute mastery of the seas. Second, trade, mountains of it. The wealth flowing into Britain from taxing goods was astronomical. But then, taxation became a problem. Britain's 13 colonies in America weren't thrilled about being taxed without having any say in Parliament. No more taxation without representation, they sighed. Britain didn't listen. Tensions boiled over. In 1775, revolution broke out. The following year, the colonies declared independence. 8 years of war later, Britain was forced to recognize the United States of America as an independent nation. Losing America was a gut punch, but Britain didn't collapse. Instead, it shifted focus Asia, the Pacific, Africa. Captain James Cook was out surmapping the Pacific, claiming New Zealand and Australia for Britain. When Cook was killed in Hawaii during his third voyage, his discoveries lived on. Australia became a dumping ground for convicts who'd once been shipped to America. The first fleet arrived in 1788, and the transportation continued for decades. Britain also pushed into the North Pacific and deep into the interior of North America. Expanding British North America westward through the fur trade and the exploration. Then Napoleon happened. The French Revolution gave rise to Bonaparte, and Britain suddenly faced an existential threat. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports and smashed their overseas possessions. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 was the turning point. Admiral Nelson was killed, but Britain destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets. That victory secured British naval supremacy for the next 140 years. Nobody could touch them at sea. When the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, Britain scooped up even more territory: Malta, Mauritius, Ceylon, the Chape Colony, islands across the Caribbean. These places had sugar plantations dependent on enslaved labor, and Britain had profited massively from the slave trade. But the Industrial Revolution was changing things. Goods could be produced at home. Abolitionist movements gained traction. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade. Slavery itself was abolished in 1834. From 1815 to 1914, Britain's imperial power peaked. This was Britain's imperial century. The British East India Company kept expanding. Singapore was founded in 1819. Hong Kong and Shanghai were seized after the First Opium War in 1842. But India itself became a problem. In 1857, local troops rebelled in the Sepoy Rebellion. The company crushed the uprising, but the British government decided the company couldn't be trusted to rule India anymore. In 1858, India was brought under direct crown rule. It became the jewel in the crown, the empire's most valuable possession. Russia was becoming a threat, though. They wanted to expand into Central Asia and the Mediterranean. When Russia invaded Ottoman territory in 1853, Britain and France jumped in, sparking the Crimean War. Britain won, and Russia backed off. A deal was struck in 1878, defining spheres of influence, and Britain snagged Cyprus as insurance. Africa was next. British settlers flooded into the Chape colony, pushing Dutch-descended Boers northward. The Boers established independent republics, but Britain eventually conquered them in the Second Anglo-Boer War in ke-1902. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, became vital for trade. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882 to secure it. The scramble for Africa followed, with Britain grabbing huge chunks of the eastern and the southern continent. By 1900, Britain controlled trade routes, economies, and even nations outside its empire: China, Argentina, Siam. An all-red telegraph line connected every colony by ke-1902. Communication was instant, but China was brewing. Canada gained self-governance in ke-1867. Australia and New Zealand followed in ke-1900. These dominions wanted independence while staying connected to Britain. Ireland pushed for home rule, but Parliament kept rejecting it, feeling it would fracture the empire. Then came ke-1914, the First World War. Britain leaned heavily on the empire. Over 2,5 million men from dominions and the colonies served. Man never came home. Britain won, seized German and the Ottoman territory, but victory came at a devastating cost. The empire had peaked. In 1921, Ireland gained independence. Other nations started questioning their status. Then the Second World War hit in ke-1939. Britain once again called on the empire, and once again, it answered. But this time, Britain was bankrupted. Maintaining the empire became impossible. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and the 70s, colonies gained independence one by one. The wind of change swept through, and the 400 years of colonial history ended. Most nations joined the Commonwealth, and the 14 still recognized the British monarch as head of state. In 1997, Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. Man see disaster final, symbolic end of the British Empire. Closing? So what's left? Well, the legacy is everywhere. English is the most spoken language on earth. British culture, customs, and the practices are global. And the modern Britain itself, it's a living reflection of the empire. People from every corner of the former empire now call those rainy islands home. From a tiny, grey island to ruling a quarter of the planet, it's a story of ambition, brutality, innovation, and ultimately, change. The empire that once never saw the sunset has now faded into history. But its impact, that's still with us every single day. If you found this deep dive into history fascinating, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Seriously, history is wild, and there's so much more to explore. Cheers for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.